Okay, it is 11:36. I think it's a good time to start. So thank you for coming. Welcome to the session. The title of the session is Trails and Pedestrian Access, an Essential Part of a Vibrant Community. My name is Chris Etoff. I'm the moderator for this panel, and I am also the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator for Howard County, Maryland. And joined by Katie Stahl, who's going to be helping with a session from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'll be introducing our speakers, Angie Schmidt and Ethan Abbott, in a second. Did want to mention a couple housekeeping items. The session is being recorded, as I think all these sessions are. Want to be aware of that. We have our itinerary is we have two presentations that should take about 15 minutes each from our two guest speakers. And then we have the rest of the time, we have 55 minutes allotted total. So the rest of the time, the second half of the session will be devoted to question and answer, which I'll help moderate. But I would encourage everybody, we want to get some questions from you guys, from the attendees, through the available Q&A box on the right side of our screen. If you see, we have chat polls, people Q&A. So please use the Q&A link over there to type in your questions for the speakers, and I will moderate those and pick from those questions and relay those to the speakers after the presentations. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We have Angie Schmidt and Ethan Abbott. And I have Angie's bio here. So Angie Schmidt is the first speaker. She is one of the country's best known writers on the topic of sustainable transportation. She was the longtime national editor at Streetsblog, and her writing and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and NPR. She is the founder of a new firm, 3NPH Planning and Consulting, a small Cleveland-based firm which is focused on pedestrian safety. Her book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America, was published in August by Island Press. And a fun story that Angie shared with me when she was writing her book, she was busy with a small baby and a full-time job, and she had to get creative with finding time to write. So that included lots of late night writing after the baby went to bed, and even writing on the Greyhound bus as she took her work trips to Pittsburgh. So thank you, Angie, for coming. Ethan will be the second speaker. Ethan, I'll give your bio when we get there after the first presentation. So if you're ready, Angie, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for that nice introduction. Hopefully this screen sharing works out okay. Yes, here we go. So I wrote a book that was published last summer. It's called Right of Way. And oops, sorry. Can you guys see my screen? I'm fumbling. Here we go.
Yeah, take your time.
All right, there we go. So it's about when I give people sort of about this book, I say it's about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. This presentation is going to explain what I mean by that and what we can do about it. Oh. Sorry, I got to go back to Keynote. Okay. So this has been the pattern in the past 10 years, and this here is what I'm talking about. Over the last 10 years, we've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. And that is really unusual in traffic safety. Since about the 1970s, the pattern has mostly been a steady decline. And so we've seen a little bit of
Angie, sorry, 1 second. I don't think the screen's sharing yet.
It's not. So yeah, that's what I was talking about. Okay, so here we've seen this big increase, and this is really unusual in traffic safety. When it first started happening, a lot of even experts sort of thought this was a fluke or weren't certain what was going on. But now we know that it's this sustained trend. So moving ahead, I'm going to talk about why that is. So I think like a lot of the media coverage about this has been a little bit harmful sometimes. There's sort of a stereotype that pops into people's heads of who is getting killed. And it looks maybe a little bit like this guy here on the left, and he's like a very wired millennial, and he's crossing in a crosswalk, and maybe he's distracted by his phone. But the reality is, and I think one more thing, I think that's sort of what a lot of people who are a little bit privileged, for example, people who work in the media a lot of times, that's something they might see anecdotally on their drive to work. But really, the kind of person who's getting killed more over here, like this guy on the right, who's just sort of sprinting across a very wide suburban road that doesn't even have a crosswalk at this location. So moving ahead, so I'm a little bit about who is getting killed here. This is a problem that is a little bit like Corona, where you would think, oh, everyone, a disease, epidemic, everyone would be sort of affected equally. But when we look at the data and we dig in, a lot of the inequalities we have in our society really start to come through. And this is a problem that affects people of color, in particular. Black people are almost twice as likely to be killed while walking as white people, and Hispanic folks are also at increased risk, and then Native folks are at extremely high risk, about 4.5 times likely to be killed. And I'm going to talk more later in the presentation about why that is. So they're not the only group, though. Pretty much anyone who is from an identity that's a little bit marginalized is at an increased risk to be killed while walking. So that includes people with disabilities, people who live in low-income neighborhoods. But another group I want to highlight here real quickly is older folks, because this is a demographic that's growing very rapidly in the United States. And you can see here that the risk for being killed while walking starts to rise when people are as young as 50. And by the time they're 75 and older, they're about twice as likely to be killed. So as early as really about 10 years ago, groups like the CDC predicted we would see pedestrian deaths rise as this demographic increase, because the US population is aging a lot right now. Almost 1 in 4 people are 65 and older, and over the next decade, we expect that to increase to about 1 in 3, or the next few decades. So this again is not a group we've done a very good job planning for. And a lot of our signal timing and everything is not set up so that older, slower moving folks can get across the street safely. Okay, and this is also a problem that has a geographic component. This is a map produced by Transportation for America, and it shows the most dangerous states for walking in purple. And you can see there's a really clear pattern here. The southeast portion of the United States is the most dangerous place for pedestrians, and some of the safer places are in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And that goes back to our history. These southern cities, the Atlantas, the Miamis, the Houstons and Dallases and Phoenixes, those are places that grew. They experienced rapid population growth later than like the Bostons, some of the safer places up here. So while Boston was fully developed, in a pedestrian and streetcar sort of era, prior to the 1920s and 30s, these newer cities in the Southeast really developed primarily around driving in cars. So they tend to be very sprawling with wide streets. This also contributes to why we see growth in this problem, because over the last few decades, it's the Southeast portion of the United States that's captured the lion's share of population growth in the United States. So moving ahead, this is also a problem that has a geographic component at the metro level. So I'm using Cleveland here as an example, and I've never been to Baltimore, but I think Cleveland and Baltimore have a lot of the same issues. But I'm just using it as an example here, and these trends are sort of seen across the United States. So this is a map of racial segregation in Cleveland in 1990, and green is Black areas, orange is white areas, and the yellow part shows areas that are a little more diverse. So I just want to point out this trend that's been occurring. If you go over to the next slide, here we are in 1990, very segregated, obviously. Okay, so here we are in 2010. We don't have the latest census data yet, but you can see while we are still very segregated, we have a lot more diversity in our suburban areas. This again is a national trend. So not only are suburbs becoming more racially diverse, they're becoming more economically diverse. Sometimes you hear about this trend, the suburbanization of poverty. And what that means again is we have more folks that might be relying on the bus or relying on walking to the store, sort of out in locations in suburban areas that really weren't designed for pedestrians at all. These are places in a lot of cases that were built in the 50s and the 60s around the idea that everyone would, two-car household, garage, picket fence. So the infrastructure is ill-suited to that, and it puts people at risk. In addition, in many of our wealthy or coastal areas, we do have a good amount of gentrification. So that could also push people out of safer urban areas into more dangerous suburban locations. Okay, and I mentioned earlier in the presentation that this is an issue that's related to racism, to systemic racism. So here, again, I just showed sort of the racial demographics and segregation in Cleveland. And now here is a map of our most dangerous road segments. And you can see how they align almost exactly with neighborhoods of color in Cleveland. Again, that's not unusual. So a lot of times, not only are people in neighborhoods of color doing more walking because of the wealth gap, because of discrimination. They also are a lot of times passed over for the kind of street safety improvements that wealthier communities are able to get. Okay, so here's an example I like to use, and this is a different city, Portland. This shows all the traffic fatalities that occurred over a 2-year period in Portland in 2017 and 2018. And they use the names of the victims here to sort of humanize the issue, which I think is a nice touch. But as you can see, these deaths aren't happening sort of randomly. There's a clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So if we could go ahead. In Portland, for people who aren't familiar, there's a big like socioeconomic dividing line on East 82nd Street. If you can see that, it's on the right side of the map. So everything east of East 82nd Street in Portland is called East Portland. And compared to the rest of the city, it's more diverse and lower income. So they produced this nice map here showing the 30 highest crash intersections in Portland. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. So people who live in East Portland are about twice as likely to be killed in traffic than people who live in Portland at large. Okay, so just to reiterate, I'm going to try to sort of speed through the rest of this, but we have a population in the United States that's aging. We have some demographic trends with more people in the Sun Belt region of the United States, more lower income people living out in suburban areas. And then we have this third trend, which is we've had a big change in our vehicle mix in the United States. So if we go back to about 2010, when we were coming out of the last recession, almost all the new cars sold were sedans. Almost 3 in 4 new cars sold were sedans, like a Honda Civic, regular car, sort of, if you understand the lingo. Okay, so we've had this big shift over the past decade, and I think it sort of went unnoticed for a while, and now it's very apparent. We've had a big shift to SUVs, especially crossover SUVs. For the latest model year, about 3 in 4 new cars sold were pickup trucks and SUVs. So moving ahead, that turns out to have a big impact on pedestrian safety. So you can see here on the left, that first vehicle would hit me sort of in the legs. That is Honda Civic, but I'm about 5'6", just for scale. So I'm an average to tall woman. And then here, this Toyota 4Runner here on the right, that would hit me sort of in the chest or the abdomen. So that's a much more dangerous place to be struck really hard. And the first car, if I was hit by that car, I would maybe fall forward, probably onto the hood. This other car, potentially, depending on your height, could push you under the wheels, especially for children, maybe for wheelchair users. There's a risk that you're pushed under the wheels and run over. So there's really strong data showing now that this increases the risk for pedestrians. Pedestrians struck by SUVs 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed, according to the Federal Highway Administration. Pickup trucks have also gotten really enormous. This is just an image I like to use. Shows my son when he was 4 years old in front of a lifted Ford F-250. These kind of huge pickups. The Ford F-Series, by the way, is the #1 selling vehicle in the United States. Huge blind zones in the front and back of these cars that are dangerous to children. So the vehicle trends are not good for this problem. There's no sign of that slowing down right now. So real quickly, before I wrap up, I want to talk about, I know that's all very depressing. I want to talk about some strategies different cities are using to handle this, to address this issue successfully. And I like to use this example from New York City, Queens Boulevard. You probably heard of the concept of a road diet. That's what this is. So Queens Boulevard in New York used to be referred to as the Boulevard of Death. 186 people were killed on this road between 1996 and 2014. So this is a road where they're having as many as a dozen deaths a year. And one thing I want to say about that is that's actually not extremely unusual. In a lot of cities, there's one road or a handful of roads that make up a wildly disproportionate share of traffic deaths. So you can see, this is a very densely populated area, very wide road, fast road, not a lot of amenities in the before picture for pedestrians and bicyclists. But in 2014, New York City spent just a few $1 million. This was a low budget project, and they did a road diet. They took one of the lanes, they painted a sidewalk, they painted a bike lane, just added bollards. And after that, traffic deaths fell off a cliff. They went from having, again, as many as 12 or more deaths a year to having none for several years. They have since had a few deaths, but there's been a dramatic improvement. Another tool they're using is something called a pedestrian leading interval. And all that really means is they're retiming their traffic signals so that pedestrians who get the walk signal have a few seconds head start on the cars that are making their turns. That way they're more visible in the center of the intersection, because those turning motions can be very dangerous both to drivers and pedestrians. They're also using this feature called a hardened center line. Here at the center, they're just sticking something in the center of the lane, and that prevents cars from making a really wide, fast turn and forces them to take a sharper, more narrow turn, slow down speeds a little bit. So these two treatments are really inexpensive. They only cost about $1,200 per intersection for New York City to do, but they're really effective. Advocates there say where these have been installed, pedestrian crashes have declined 35 to 40%. Another thing I'm wrapping up, but I wanted to talk real quickly about streetlights, because that's a really important element of the problem. About 3/4 of pedestrian deaths occur at night. So if anyone wants to just jump in the chat, and does anyone recognize these cities? This is an image taken at night from space. Does anyone want to chime in and tell me which cities? Take a guess or name one of the cities. I'll just give you a second, because I think I'm running a little over. Someone guessed New York. No, that's not correct. Anyway, I'll just continue. At the top, we have Detroit, and at the bottom, we have Cleveland, where I live, okay? Yeah, Robert got it. So if we go back, just one thing I want to point out about this, notice how Detroit is a little bluer up here in color than Cleveland down here at the bottom where I live. Okay, moving ahead. So this is a really big success story, it turns out. Detroit had a lot of very well-known financial troubles, and they did a survey a few years back in the early part of the last decade, and they realized that a lot of their streetlights were not working. About 40% were broken, not functioning, whatever the case. I think this has been a little underexplored in urban planning, because I think it goes back a little bit to privilege. I think a lot of people who are in more influential positions can sort of just take for granted that the streetlights in their neighborhood are going to be working, but that's not the case for everyone. So in Detroit, they took action. They worked with the state. They issued $185 million in bonds, and between 2014 and 2016 here, they got all their streetlights working and they converted them to LED. So that's why it looked blue compared to Cleveland's in that picture from space. So I just want to point out here what happens with pedestrian deaths as they're doing this. So you can see, even before the project is complete, pedestrian deaths start declining rapidly. In the 2 years from the middle of the project till they're complete, they declined 35%. And the graph I know is a little hard to read, but the blue part at the top shows deaths that occur in dark, unlighted conditions. So Detroit goes from having as many as 25 or 26 a year to practically eliminating those. Once this project is complete, they get down to having just one a year. So street lights, very important. Just wanted to highlight that. Okay, finally, I'm wrapping up here, but this is the image I like to end with, and it just shows, this is called a pedestrian refuge island. Sometimes this is not a very sexy or new treatment. They can be installed for just a few $1,000s, and they're recommended by the Federal Highway Administration. They say they help reduce pedestrian crashes about 35%. So one of the points I wanted to make is that we sort of don't lack the tools. I mean, a lot of people, when I start talking about this issue, they just want to know, well, what's the solution? And the idea would be that it would be some neat designy thing, but we sort of have the design tools. What we've really lacked is the attention to this problem and the will to resolve it. And I think it goes back a little bit to privilege. I think a lot of the people, again, who are influential in the media and the government are sort of not experiencing the conditions along dangerous roads from a pedestrian perspective firsthand. And so they're not very sympathetic to people who are dealing with that and the fallout from that. So serious injuries and fatalities. That's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, and I'm traveling around trying to raise awareness, because we do have a lot of tools to address this. And a lot of times it can be addressed relatively inexpensively, but we really have just lacked the will. And also we haven't really institutionalized some of the best practices yet. We're still sort of on autopilot from the previous era that was all based around moving cars. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to turn it over to Ethan, who's going to help put a lot of this information in local perspective. I know that they were working on some really cool stuff there locally at Rails to Trails. Just a quick plug before I do that: if you do want to pick up the book, you can get a discount, 20% off through the publisher, Island Press, just by using my last name. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Angie. Let me get back my other screen. So yeah, thank you. Great kind of overview from the national perspective there on some of the trends, the issues, and also some of the solutions. So that's going to dovetail nicely into Ethan's presentation, which is going to be more localized to the Baltimore area. So while Ethan is pulling up his screen share, Ethan, if you want to work on that while I do your complete introduction. So Ethan Abbott is our next speaker. Ethan is the project manager for the Baltimore Greenway Trail Network project, which is a 35-mile network of multi-use trails that will link together the city's diverse neighborhoods, cultural amenities, and outdoor resources, while providing residents with increased connectivity and accessibility. Prior to joining Rails to Trails Conservancy, Ethan worked for Baltimore City as a recreational programmer, where he exposed the city's residents to their natural resources, the local parks, trails, and waterways that exist in their backyard. Here he became exposed to the city's natural environment in a way he never thought was possible. Ethan has experience in community outreach and development and holds a bachelor's degree in environmental planning from Towson University. And a little bit more fun background on Ethan is he also lives in Baltimore City, and his free time, he enjoys biking around the city and exploring its many cool hidden gems. He also dreams of the day he'll be able to see live music again. hopefully that is soon, Ethan. I think we're starting to get there. So Ethan has his screen share up, and I'm going to turn it over to Ethan. Keep those questions coming in the Q&A, because remember, we're going to have the session after Ethan's presentation for Q&A. Take it away, Ethan.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch, Chris. Really appreciate it. And just making sure you guys can actually, excuse me, you guys can see my screen, correct?
Yes, I can see the screen, Ethan, so I think others can too.
No worries. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. So yeah, and thank you also, Angie, for teeing up a lot of this conversation. It was a great presentation. And again, thank you, Chris, as well. Like Chris said, I'm Ethan Abbott. I am here with the Baltimore Greenway Trail Network here at the Rails to Trails Conservancy. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here today to be able to talk to you guys a bit about the project that we have going on in Baltimore, which can be a really cool and reinvigorating way that we think about transportation infrastructure here within Baltimore. So just a general overview, though, I kind of want to give you guys a general scope of the project that we have in the background of it too, and then also go over some of the intersections of our work where we've seen, how pedestrian safety and infrastructure plays out. But I guess before doing that, I kind of want to take a step back and look at what we just do at Rails to Trails Conservancy as a whole, and kind of how the Baltimore project fits in with the larger work. And so the Baltimore project is actually part of our suite of trail projects, which are all designed around the same thing, connecting people and communities via these multi-use trail systems, that really do deliver a plethora of different amenities and connections too. They connect people to other places. They provide opportunities for increased access or increased active transportation methods, and also recreation opportunities too. But it is really the focus of the breadth of RTC's work. And again, all over the country that these trail network initiatives really do the same thing. But let's actually scale down a bit and look at the Baltimore Greenway in particular and see just how it can be a cool benefit to the city in and of itself. And so this is actually a great aerial view that kind of shows you guys just the general scope of the project and kind of where it will actually touch and some of the different amenities that it will connect to. Again, it largely is bike and pedestrian friendly and focused as well. But I mean, just look at these different amenity connections. This is from a view from Southeast Baltimore, looking kind of northward, where you can see the different things that the Greenway will potentially connect when it's actually built and constructed for. Look at the foreground and the background, you see local parks, you see local trails itself, the existing and the non-existing trails too. So when we're talking about the trail network, we really are talking about connectivity in a multitude of different ways.
Ethan, I still see your starting page. I don't know if is it advanced on your end? There you go. Now it advanced.
Ah, interesting. Can you guys see that better?
That's better. I can see the overview map now. If you hit the full screen button down there.
Let's see.
Oh, the presentation. Yeah, that presentation mode. I think that helps. That looks good.
Cool. Perfect. Technology issues. You're never going to get rid of them, But yeah, so like I said, this is a great visual showing the entire scope of the Greenway network. But I mean, it really does have a potential to benefit the city in a multitude of ways. And so let's go over a few of those just generally and quickly. So when we're talking about this increased connectivity and what those trails can provide, new connections can provide, connections for people to get to new places that they've never been before or really did not have the opportunity to get to before for whatever reason it may be. So thereby essentially promoting social equity. Same thing for health and wellness too. When we think about this increased connectivity that the trail network can provide, and we're thinking about, opportunities for increased recreation literally within people's backyards. Instead of having to go towards or drive to a park system, you can actually walk out your front door and walk within 15 minutes and actually access this kind of trail system and get to anywhere. And again, get recreation at the same time. And I just mentioned park systems too. We like to think of these trail systems really as extensions of the Baltimore system park system, or the Baltimore City park system, excuse me. So when actually designing and constructing for these corridor segments, the environment is really at the forefront of the conversation. And so is people as well, obviously. And of course, one of the key things that this trail network can provide for residents of the city is just increased access to anything, but doing it so by providing these active transportation connections, really getting walkers, bikers, rollerbladers, I mean, whoever, giving them the opportunity to not have to rely on public transit, or, you know, to not have to rely on the typical systems that they do to actually get around, which may not serve their needs as adequately as, you know, a public transit system probably should. And then last we have is the fact that these trail systems can and have the potential to really stimulate economic development within local areas as well. So let's move forward a bit. I kind of want to go over just a brief overview of it really helps tell the story of, you know, what the Greenway can do and where it will actually reach. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar about the project in its totality, it really is this awesome, all-encompassing 35-mile trail network that actually builds on the city's existing trail infrastructure network. And if you're looking at the map, those are the solid bolded lines that we see. So we have the Gwynns Falls Trail, the Jones Falls Trail, and also over in Northeast Baltimore, the Herring Run Trails. But the focus of our project right now is getting up and running those interconnecting corridor gaps. And those are the ones that you see on the map. Those are those hashed trail segments that connect the entire loop together. And essentially when it's actually complete and when it's up and running, you know, we'll actually be able to connect residents and communities of all different sorts throughout the city to, again, other neighborhoods, other cultural amenities, and of course, other natural resources that exist within the area. And I want to note that there are only 10 of the 35 miles that exist within the total network. Those corridor gaps, there are really only 10 miles of corridor gaps left that we really need to A, fund for, B, design for, and then C, eventually construct for. But when it's said and done, it really will promote and create kind of a new standard for economic or equitable development, excuse me. And equitable development is kind of the forefront of our mindset and of our thinking when we're actually trying to plan this process. And for those unfamiliar, equitable development basically is a type of community planning process where the community is really at the forefront of the conversation. And we're currently working on an equitable development plan that will essentially ensure that with whatever local developments that are encroaching and coming to the city, that the community's needs, wants, and of course, opinions are at the forefront of those conversations. So the plan will eventually include potentials to, you know, or recommendations to avoid anti-displacement or ways to prevent anti-displacement measures, but developing the trail network in a way that can also, you know, provide people with job opportunities too, whether it be workforce development or local, you know, cleanup efforts too along the trail as actually being built. So again, we really are trying to redefine the way that transportation infrastructure within the city is getting done, but also the way it's getting done too. And again, with communities really at the forefront of that conversation. And this slide is actually just a little bit about the progress highlights about the Greenway. And again, it's just general background information for you guys. And for this stuff, I think there are about 3 general pillars that I kind of want to highlight, or 3 key aspects of the highlights that are really the most important. The first and foremost is the fact that there's been a groundswell of community support behind the project since its inception. That's the first bullet you see there, is the coalition of 60+ organizations. Back in 2016, at the onset of the project, it was ourselves, a local advocacy group called Bike More, and as well as that coalition too, the organization of about 50+ neighborhood groups, community groups, you name it, universities that were all invested around getting the trail network up and running and truly seeing the benefits that it could provide to their local neighborhoods, but also to the city as a whole. And that in and of itself has led to the next key milestone in terms of highlights, which is the fact that the city now has fully endorsed the project, which is great and amazing. And actually back in 2018, they adopted it and incorporated it into their city's Green Network Plan. So the Greenway Trail Network really now is officially a city planning document. And not only that, but it has the full endorsement of Mayor Scott, who multiple times in the past year has touted the Greenway as a potential way to, solve a lot of the systemic inequity issues that exist within the cities. And I guess both of those kind of play into each other. And also the third pillar as well, which I want to identify, is really the fact that we've had a lot of key funding throughout this project, and especially up until this point, and even more recently too. Just last week, $3.2 million in member designated projects was awarded to the Greenway project, which shows that there's a significant amount of groundswell, again, at the local level, at the state level, and also at the federal level too, for this type of infrastructure. And it shows that there's investment literally across the board for people trying to get invested in this Greenway. But let's keep moving. And so actually let me take a step back just 1 second and kind of show you guys just some of the corridor gaps that I kind of want to focus on next. If you guys are looking at the map itself, I have 2 renderings queued up that I want to talk about that will actually talk more about the trail network specifically and what aspects and how beneficial it can be to those specific communities. But the ones that we're going to be looking at are, first and foremost, we have this east side connection over here. That's the hashed yellow corridor on the east side. And then the second rendering we're going to take a look at is down in South Baltimore, which is this pink trail right here, which again, both projects are, in the making right now. And we're working very hard with communities to actually ensure that what their wants and their needs are actually involved in this process. But this is actually a rendering of the first corridor that I mentioned over in East Baltimore. And it is along Haven Street, for those of you familiar, which is one of the north-south running thoroughfares within East Baltimore. But for those of you who don't know, it is a highly trafficked area for, of course, cars and vehicles, but also for truck routes too. And what's cool about this rendering and the potential about the Greenway over in this section of town is the fact that when built, it'll actually take up and use one of the unused rail corridors that runs right parallel to Haven Street. So what you have essentially is getting people away from this high stressed, high activity, street and getting them towards this sort of active transportation network that's literally parallels that same street. But not only that, provides, again, increased business activity or just connectivity to local areas as well. And actually working with local community partners too over in that area, specifically with the Brewers Hill neighborhood, who are very much interested in the project too. And Brewers Hill is a community within Southeast Baltimore too. But the neighborhood association is really on board the project, and some of the ideas that we've talked about in the meantime, when the project is actually not built, is how do you again account for placemaking, or how do you make sure that trail safety or pedestrian safety is at the forefront of the conversation. So with some of these groups, we're talking about having ideas of creating potential pop-up parks in the meantime, when the trail actually does get built, to show and to inform people that this trail network really can be a benefit to their community, but also to the aspects that they see fit to, like the key pedestrian aspects or the key safety that they feel needed when the trail network comes to their area. And so the next rendering I actually have is kind of similar. And actually, this is one of my favorite and more interesting renderings that we have because it's based in South Baltimore, which is an area that's ripe for revitalization. And actually, Middle Branch Waterfront is actually currently going through its redevelopment phasing process. So it really ways to incorporate, and revitalize that waterfront down in South Baltimore. But what's interesting is that the Greenway Trail Network and part of the existing segments of the Greenway Trail Network actually run parallel and actually run through this Middle Branch waterfront connection. So we've been working with local communities and also local developers in that area to figure out how best to make sure that the Greenway is kept in place and is maintained, but also B, with new connections to the Greenway, how can it be a benefit to those neighborhoods? And a lot of these South Baltimore neighborhoods do feel disenfranchised or do feel disconnected from the rest of the city too. So during these conversations, we've been talking about how ways that the Greenway can truly be a benefit to them. And the next slide, I actually tee up a bit more about this specific connection in West Baltimore too, or in South Baltimore too, excuse me. But let's talk about some of the better connections that the Greenway can actually provide to residents. And so, yeah, I guess the first one is, of course, job access too. We're talking about the fact that the trail network can connect people from one location to another, but can also connect people who don't have opportunities in the areas to areas with, again, high opportunity too. So connecting people to local economic center or local job centers too. And I mentioned on the last slide the fact that that Westport community, which was showed in the rendering, they actually feel that they're largely disconnected from a lot of the city, even though they sit right within South Baltimore. I mean, they're right south of downtown and right south of the Inner Harbor too, but they still feel disconnected from the city. And not only that, but they have no walkability, and their streets are like highly trafficked, again, with large truck routes and again, just high vehicle access. So the conversation we've been having with them involve how do you make the Greenway Trail Network accessible and truly integral for their needs and what they want as pedestrians, and how to get them crossed over and connected to the local areas that really matter to them. And so better connections also play into the health aspect of a lot of city residents. Looking at the map, this is actually pretty interesting, but the areas in red have pretty low physical activity. Meanwhile, the areas in green, of course, have the highest rates of physical activity in the city. What you see is that largely over on the east side and west side of Baltimore, those are the areas that do not have adequate access to roads, to cars even, to public transit. So what the Greenway really can do is provide them with that access, that direct access to get on trails and to be able to get active in their community and in their spaces. And then lastly, as far as mapping goes wise, is the fact that these connections can really increase the connectivity, that really exists within Baltimore City. And I know I mentioned equity and inclusion a lot, but within Baltimore, I think we talk about equity or the lack thereof. And a lot of times when people do, and Angie mentioned this too, it's the fact that sometimes, and unfortunately, road infrastructure has been used as a tool to almost disenfranchise folks. People have been actually disconnected from entire other parts of the communities or entire other parts of the cities just by the fact that they have a road going down the area that is truly not meant for pedestrian access to. So that's one of the aspects of the Greenway is looking to adjust to. But when it's said and done, the Greenway will actually connect over 75 neighborhoods within Baltimore City. And those 75 neighborhoods will be each within about a half mile of the Greenway network. And so again, think about that in terms of context for the larger scale. That's most of Baltimore City residents who will be at least within a half mile of the trail network. So yeah, the Greenway really does have the opportunity to connect these areas of low opportunity, low property values, low incomes, lack of access to cars or to vehicles, and give them that opportunity via this awesome active transportation connection that we're planning that is fully on board. And just for clarification, the map actually what you see is the areas in dark blue have, of course, the higher life expectancy, while areas or in white or the lighter areas have the lower life expectancy. And again, that's Baltimore's communities. Largely the more disenfranchised communities situated on the east or the west side don't have that adequate access to a lot of things and amenities that they should have and that other parts of the city do have access to. So the Greenway really in terms of equity has the ability to address a lot of those issues too. And now is actually pretty cool because I want to get into some of the ways that we've seen pedestrian access or pedestrian safety, in and around the work that we've been doing within Baltimore. And so this is actually a pretty cool little video that I have queued up. And this actually took place back in 2016, kind of at the onset of the work, or even at the project, the onset of the Greenway itself. But it was between ourselves at Rails for Trails Conservancy and along with a local group called Bike More, who are close partners, and a local biking advocacy group. But it was between the two of us and of course the coalition, the 60 plus organizations that are supportive of the Greenway. We all came together to do this pop-up charrette, this crosswalk that really enhanced pedestrian safety and did it in a way that incorporated art and placemaking too. So I'm going to play this video in a second, but it really does show you guys just, again, some of the work that we've been doing, especially the programming sense, to actually address some of these issues. And it's just a 1-minute video, so I'm going to go through it and let you guys just see what the work that we did is all about.
The Druid Hill Market has become the new town center for the neighborhoods around the park. Unfortunately, the Druid Hill Farmers Market is a drive-to market, and that's because of this super highway across the street.
It's 4 lanes, 5, and you got to run. Actually run.
Nope. My apologies.
Around the park. Unfortunately, the Druid Hill Farmers Market is a drive-to market. And that's because of this super highway across the street.
It's 4 lanes, it's 5, and you got to run. Actually run.
For years, we've had difficulty crossing the street and trying to get our daycares from the community to get over to the park.
When you have to cross a highway to get to a park, it doesn't feel like your neighborhood park, even though you live 50 feet from it.
With this demonstration project, we're showing how through an increased visibility of the crosswalk, we can make this safer for people to cross the street.
When you have communities that are connected to each other, you have a healthy, vibrant city.
We're really trying to build capacity throughout the city of Baltimore to get people really excited about the trail loop that can connect every neighborhood.
And so that kind of tees up some of the work that we've been doing. But that is, again, a cute little video that we've had. But again, it does show the connection between the trail network and the potential connections that it can provide, but also how that trail network can address some of the systemic issues that, again, exist within Baltimore City. That trail or that section of road that they mentioned was what I was alluding to previously when I was talking about roads and infrastructure that have actually disenfranchised and disconnected residents from complete other parts of the city too. And like Angie mentioned too, that's indicative of the fact that a lot of times now, cars are centric. Cities are more car centric than ever. So a lot of times pedestrian access and pedestrian safety goes by the wayside. But with this trail network and with the network that we're doing, we're really trying to promote that, especially as it is some of the residents' key concerns within their areas too. And they see and know how the Greenway can be a benefit to them, and specifically that way. And
Hey,
so,
Ethan,
yeah, what's up?
sorry to interrupt. I was just going to kind of give you a 2-minute, if you could try to wrap up, just so we have some time for questions at the end.
No
I
worries.
think you've just got a few more slides, but if you can try to go within 2 minutes.
Sure thing. Yeah, no, this is actually kind of my last slides that I'm doing, and I'm
Perfect.
wrapping up.
Thank
And I
you.
just want to show you guys some others who basically joined the movement too. I mentioned that the pop-up that we just did, how it kind of informed and kind of used placemaking as a way to emphasize pedestrian safety and access. But these are some of the other things that in Baltimore that we've seen that kind of do the same exact thing. And these are actually more recent too. And the first one that we have is actually the Big Jump, which again was an idea in a pilot program spurred by our partners at Bike More. But again, it basically is a way to incorporate pedestrian infrastructure and safely along a very high traffic road within the city. And this road, it's the top left picture that you see. This is actually one of the same roads as in the previous video that you saw. But again, highly trafficked areas that are used by walkers and bikers and whatever other pedestrians, but they do not feel like they have adequate access. So the Big Jump was a pilot program that was introduced to try to solve that. You can see how it does that by some of the water barriers that are installed all along this major thoroughfare too. Second we have is design for distancing, which is actually something recently that came out of the COVID effort. But again, this is the bottom picture that depicts, and it kind of plays into the thing that Angie was talking about, streetscaping as well, but more so from the art side. So how, again, art and streetscaping and placemaking can be used, A, as a tool to promote social distancing, but B, as a way to, increase pedestrian safety as well. When you're talking about, making these art infrastructure projects, but also, connecting them to, or making sure that they have ways to increase pedestrian safety, making sure they're wide enough, making sure they have proper curb cutouts, things that really do increase, the fact that pedestrians are at the forefront of this conversation. And the last two are actually things central to Baltimore City. The first one being the Slow Streets program that we just recently unveiled, that I'm sure many of you have actually seen in your locales as well. But again, whole streets closed off to local through traffic, and more so specifically catering to the lowest common denominator, walkers, bikers, people who are using, the lowest form of active transportation, their bodies themselves. And that also plays into the fact that the city actually adopted back in 2018 a complete streets ordinance, which basically is a planning tool and a planning approach that really does redefine and elevate the priority of pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users in the planning field. So going forward, what's cool is the fact that now that the Greenway is actually part of, the city planning effort, any of the trail infrastructure that is built within the city right of way will have to incorporate these street ordinances as well, as per the complete streets ordinance. So making sure that they're pedestrian friendly, making sure that the sidewalks are wide enough, or making sure that, whatever other design principle that the ordinance outlines, that the Greenway adheres to that too, again, elevating pedestrian safety to the top. But that kind of wraps up the presentation I had. These are just some target goals for our next few years. Of course, key network planning and community engagement. And again, that equitable development strategy that I mentioned too, making sure that communities are really at the forefront of the conversation when it comes to developing their areas too, and making sure that their needs, which are largely pedestrian focused, are heard and desired too. And of course, communication and branding campaign. How do we get the city and also local residents to vie for and to really own the project themselves, especially local communities. But that is it. This is a slide of just our local partners that we work with, who are part of the coalition. And with that being said, that kind of ends my presentation. And thank you guys very much. These are just some links to some of the work that we do, the Trail Nation slides, the Baltimore Greenway Trail Network itself, and also some of the cool policies that are going on that really help support the Greenway going forward. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Ethan. As a neighbor of Baltimore City, I'm inspired by this, and I can't wait to come and check more things out as they come online. So we are short on time, but let's have a couple of questions for the speakers. I have one for Angie about video cameras. So video cameras have increased visibility of issues with police brutality recently. Like, do you think there's a potential similar effect for pedestrian safety issues where footage from video cameras may help with the awareness of what's actually happening in some of these incidents, and kind of like you mentioned before, enable people to see how challenging it is sometimes to navigate our streets as a pedestrian?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So they are able to use sort of camera technology to improve the visibility around a lot of big trucks now, and even cars, which I think could positively impact pedestrian safety. It also might be possible to use video footage and computer programs to better document. For a long time, we haven't really even known how many people are walking, and that allows engineers to just sort of ignore, because they just assume almost no one is walking, or only a few people are walking. So there is sort of potential about that. As far as sort of first person, I mean, we have seen viral videos where people are harassed for jaywalking, or involved in police brutality incidents for jaywalking that have received attention and been videotaped, and I think that's been helpful also. And sort of, I've been involved with a campaign in California where they're talking about decriminalizing jaywalking, and they actually did that sort of in Virginia already. So not exactly, but there are opportunities, I guess.
Yep, great. And then question for Ethan about your project. Can the greenways serve multiple purposes, say for implementation of green infrastructure, for erosion prevention and urban flood mitigation? So do you have those kind of considerations for, you've got the mobility solutions, but is it potential for those kind of environmental and green prevention methods as well?
There are as well. So what's interesting about the Greenway is that, again, I mentioned it, a lot of the way the Greenway works is that it's building upon the existing trail infrastructure within the city. So most of the corridor gaps that we're actually building and developing to get the whole network running online do not really cross over with, not directly on the park's green spaces too. So you're not going to see any of the new existing corridor gaps running along local stream valleys, that exist within Baltimore City or running along the city's forests or parks. The existing trails already do that. But still, we think about the Greenway in its totality. So when we're talking about even the interconnecting corridor gaps, the existing trail segments are still on the forefront of our mind. And those, unfortunately, do have systemic issues that they deal with. One of the Northeast Baltimore park systems, the Herring Run Trail, which again was that Northeast connection, they're currently going through a stream restoration process too. So the long story is there's a lot of stuff behind the project, but yes, we think about the project in terms of a totality. And that means any aspect of the trail segment, again, whether it's existing or built, is at the forefront. And same thing for those environmental aspects too. So yeah, basically.
Okay, well, that fills our time. So I just wanted to say thanks again to the speakers, to Ethan and Angie. Great job. It's great to hear about your projects and your efforts. And thank you to those that attended. And enjoy the rest of your sessions. I think going back to the reception is the right thing to do at this time to get ready for your next session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, Ethan.
What's up, Angie?
Can I ask you a question? I'm
Hit
just
me.
curious. So is there any talk about sort of zoning, any like zoning trails for retail? Are there any examples that retail fronting, or I just wonder if that would make, the trail system a little bit more usable if there was a little retail. I realize it might be hard to support.
So it kind of is. So there is talks about rezoning in specific areas of the trail network where we're building those corridor gaps. Some of them are zoned for just residential. But we've had conversations with local communities, and not just actually in multiple communities spread all throughout, about how rezoning in certain areas can allow for, can be beneficial to their neighborhoods too. Certain residential areas that the Greenway is coming towards really do want to see kind of that rezoning aspect too, from residential to more mixed use, so that when the trail network comes to the area, and if it's implemented in a way that's truly beneficial to them via like an equitable development plan, then you can see not just the trail network, how it'll increase connections to recreation, but also increase connections to local businesses that exist in the area, or really uplift their community in a variety of ways, or even invite other businesses too, or other organizations, or whatever it may be, to come into the area. So it's a long story, or it's a long way to say yes, basically. The conversation about rezoning and zoning in general is very much going on within the Rails to Trails project, and especially between us and our work that we're doing with the city, because again, now it is really a city project. So
I think like maybe the Beltway in Atlanta does have, but of course they've had a lot of displacement. So
exactly. Yeah, and so that's one of the things we've been looking at, the Atlanta Beltline too. Also the 11th Street Bridge project, trying to glean best practices from them, since they've already actually developed their trail infrastructure projects too. But yeah, it's the same exact thing. I understand what you mean.
In Cleveland, we just had a big bunch of trails come online. If you ever get it, have you ever been here?
I've actually not, no. Well, it was when I was younger, so I don't really remember anything about it.
Oh, you might find it interesting if you ever do get a chance, because I think Baltimore and Cleveland are a little bit similar in some ways. And we just completed a big bunch of trails. One of them, I'm sorry.
No,
one of them we got a Tiger Grant for. But the equity of them is not sort of where it should be. So I think now it's more of the wider areas that have gotten them, and I think now they're going to turn attention to the Black neighborhoods more, the east side of Cleveland. But
right.
Hopefully they'll get the same kind of financial support and everything for that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the same thing with Baltimore too. And I'm curious, is the trail you're talking about, is that part of the Industrial Heartlands Trails Coalition that's going on, or is that a bit different? Because that's one of Rails to Trails has had and played a heavy hand in some of those existing trail infrastructure projects that's going on. But
good question. It's really cool. It's really like it goes right past our Industrial Valley are functional steel mills. So it's real, like when you ride through it, it's really like old and new economy,
Right.
but sort of on both sides. It's really, I mean, they were working on this for like 10 years. Everyone was always talking about it. I'm a big cyclist and I was always kind of like, you know, whatever. It never seemed like it was going to happen. And now it really is like amazing and game changing. But like I said, the equity aspect of it is just there's missing pieces. So hopefully, but there is around the county a lot of trail work happening. So I think like it takes so long, but 10, 20 years, we might really have a functional like county trail system. We'll see.
Which is, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I think that's a good distinction. Baltimore is a small city geographically. So, I mean, it's as opposed to a county. So it's not working with X amount of different municipalities or organizations too. It's much more centered and focused. So, I mean, but the same issues, especially with inequity, arise, especially in terms of neighborhoods that have seen more beneficial projects. Again, those kind of north-south communities, as opposed to the eastern, western.
Yeah.
But I just think because, again, kind of the size of Baltimore, it's a bit easier it's not easy. That's an understatement. Or not the right statement. But I think it's a bit more manageable to think and to talk and to actually strategically address some of those issues. And I'm hoping, and I believe that the equitable development plan can be a true way to do that, because we have the community connections for it. We really do. It's just a matter of having those conversations with the city and making sure that they're at really the forefront of the planning effort that is going forward. So.
Yeah. Well, very cool. It was super nice to meet you and hear about this.
Yeah, you too. Actually, we had some of our staff members are actually very much interested in your work, and we're reading your book as well. So I was excited to be on a panel with you too.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Well, hopefully our paths will cross again.
I'm definitely sure they will.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks, Angie. Take it easy.